Thank you for joining us for another episode of Southern Utah University's Teaching and Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Matt McKenzie. As we continue our conversation with Dr. Richard Saunders, we're going to explore how do we go cross-curricular. If I'm teaching in the education department, how can I reach out and talk to my colleagues in the sciences or performing visual arts? We're going to explore ways that Dr. Saunders believes we can go cross-curricular in our curriculum. Join us now as we continue our conversation about scholarly publishing and being cross-curricular in our endeavors. In our last episode, you mentioned that you should look to get cross-curricular.
You can. That's a good place to do it. That's a good way to do things outside of your field and push your own boundaries. Yeah.
So I want to ask a question, because this is a comment I've heard at SU quite a bit, and I've heard it at other institutions as well. Sometimes faculty feel siloed. What recommendations would you give a faculty member who wants to go cross-curricular but isn't sure how to make that first step?
I don't have an ultimate answer. I can tell you what I do or would do.
Yeah.
Number one, talk with my chair and say, this is something I think is interesting, but I need somebody beyond me. And just get their input, because chairs often have a view of things that faculty in the trenches may not see, either with time or with resources. And the goal is to involve another person. It's not just that the chair is the be-all, end-all. It's just they're usually in a position to see resources that faculty may not see immediately. Okay, that's the first thing. Okay. The second thing is start talking to people and take someone out for coffee or for a soda or for lunch or something like that and say, tell me about your work and what you're doing and how it fits. I'm trying to think of an example where I've seen that done.
Well, I know Scott Knowles and I just met.
There's a good example.
And he was asking me a lot of questions about my doctoral research and what was I focusing on, and then we talked a little bit about his world in the College of PVA and theater and performing arts, and so we talked a lot about how does my research on accessibility relate to someone who is teaching, could potentially be teaching dance or could be teaching some type of artistic thing. So, that was a great conversation that I had where it's someone I would not necessarily have sat down with and had a conversation with. We had other reasons, both being on exec boards for SU, but our conversation led to that. And so that's given me some different thoughts of, wow, I've been thinking this manner with my research.
Right.
I didn't even think about this area.
That is the nature of the collegium, the old Latin term, the college. We group people together in colleges, but the collegium is really a meeting of minds, exactly as you describe. It's a way of getting beyond just and part of the challenge. Let me segue into something else here. Yeah. Part of the challenge of academia is that we tend to be stuck within a department and within a field, and we have come through a graduate program that taught us to do this. But when we get to a campus and we decide we need to do that as well as this, or something besides that and this, that's where we need to kind of stretch our minds, because that's what a collegium is. That's the way we function. That's where it's really fun too. I mean, just frankly, that's where it's really cool. There's lots of basic science that's happening, but there's lots more opportunity for applying one field to another field than there ever is in the basic description of a particular field. So keep in mind that research, especially when you're talking about research isn't just the basic science or the basic history or the basic whatever. The Boyer model is tremendous. Part of the scholarship of teaching is teaching my field. So for instance, a very good friend of mine in Montana, when I was in Montana, He was not a basic scientist, but Greg was a gifted teacher of chemistry. And so one of the things that he did was to write a series of chemistry demonstrations for a particular group of fields. And he had dozens of them. And that is, quite frankly, as much research as somebody who is doing research into sodium chloride or something else like that. Right. So don't fear to be pigeonholed, and don't worry less, I think, about the need to do the basic science than to just do something really good and pushing a boundary someplace. I encourage people to do that in any setting.
Pushing that boundary, getting that little, as I tell my team, finding that uncomfortable tension. You don't want to be to where you're in pain.
No, but
you want that uncomfortableness. That's how you grow.
Yeah, that's stretching. Yeah, that's stretching oneself. And frankly, again, when you stop stretching, you really stop being a faculty member. You just become an automaton.
So I know we started the conversation talking mainly about journals and articles. I do want to shift a little bit and talk about books, because I know that's slightly different. You could be asked to do a chapter. You could write your own book. I know there's several faculty here at SU who are currently in the process of writing their own book or doing acting as editors of a book. Right. What do you see the future of book publishing? Because I know we use inclusive access in some courses, things like that. Right. Where does this all head?
Well, that's a real challenge. And frankly, I could sit here for a couple of hours and just give you the background and where this is moving. Part of the challenge is, again, just like journals, it's so easy to publish books these days that everybody's doing it. In fact, I have my very first academic book was done with a scholarly press as what's called short run printing. So it was a hardback book, had a beautifully printed jacket. They didn't sell an awful lot of copies, but they printed a bunch of them in a short run. So there are fewer than 1,000 copies. My most recent book, which will sell 5 or 6 times as much, has been done, same production, but the manufacturing is all being handled by print on demand. The press has simply given up short run printing, and print on demand is it. That's just the way it is. It's important for faculty to recognize that not all fields are the same. Not all fields. Some are monograph dependent. For example, English and history. That is where the real communication happens. That's where you stretch out and you do things. Yes, they publish in journals, but the real action is in the monographs. If you're in business, then case studies take a much bigger position of the field. If you're in criminal justice or if you're in something else, then journals may be really your thing. Maybe the sciences are there. Yeah, they do some publishing in books, but their real action is in journal articles. So understand your field. Not everybody has to write a book. Not everybody has to write an article. There's different reasons to do long-form books and short-form articles writing in any field. You just have to decide what you want to do and where it needs to fit. Books present a challenge because you have to get out of the short-form thinking and think more about long-form structure. So a book is more than just a collection of chapters, unless it's an edited volume, in which case it is a collection of chapters. But in a book, one usually starts with a broad conception and then uses chapters to move through different facets of those ideas. Okay? So for instance, my most recent book is a biography. Well, there's different ways to structure biographies. If you're Leonard Arrington writing about Brigham Young, for instance, he has a thematic biography. So he takes Young's approach to this subject or that subject or this activity, and he explores that in a chapter like that. And when you get together, you have a book. My work tends to be much more linear. So you start when they're, cradle to grave. You start when they're young. You end up when they're dead or when they're old or when they're retired or whatever. And that's how I structured my book. But in the middle of that, I have some digressive chapters where in this one I talk about the emerging nature of academic scholarly publishing in the Americas in the 1950s and 60s. Because the person I was writing about, that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to make a living in publishing. What he discovered, is like most academics discover, is you can't make a living from academic writing. That just doesn't work unless you write commercial textbooks. And he did not do that. He missed that boat. And so that's what happened to his career. Commercial publishing itself is changing as well. We're getting out of the textbook world and much more into the interactive world, and that comes to where your interest in accessibility.
Yeah.
The challenge is that the book, long-form writing, is still significant. It's just not possible for an individual to come up with a textbook and all of the ancillaries that go along with it. To use a phrase, it takes a village. When I was working in the 90s in publishing, it's really before the digital world had really taken off, I recognized as I was looking through the front matter of the books that I was serving as production editor for, that before I even saw the manuscript, that nearly 100 people had had their hands in this thing. That's why commercial publishing works, is because they keep finding ways to add value to things, but it's almost never only the author. In fact, it's rarely the author anymore who actually does all of the work in a textbook. So that's part of the challenge, and that's part of what is shifting with the way that books are being handled.
And I know that, so where I came from, we actually went full digital textbook, and students opted out, and they could say, I want to print.
Yep.
But I know one of the benefits that we ran into was that interactivity between the professor and the student then, because a lot of those...
It changes the interactivity.
It does.
It changes dramatically, and it works for some fields, and it doesn't work very well for other fields. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to textbooks on a college campus or in a discipline. And books in a discipline too. I mean, there's different reasons to do different types of things. But the idea of interactability is becoming more significant. The publication of data sets, for instance. Not enough just to do the book. I want to see the data that you're using so I can see what the data tells me about what you've discovered. Right. The publication of formulas and the way that formulas are structured and worked. That's where scholarship is really starting to expand. It's beginning to use digital technology, and there's some downsides to this too, but it's using digital technology in order to allow people into behind the curtain so they can see how the sausage is made and see if the sausage was actually made the way the author says it was made.
Right.
And that's really important because that's part of the way we trust each other, right? Is to say it's not enough just to publish a book. Anybody can publish a book. Now I can publish a book and here's my data that backs it up and here's the question set that I do and here's.
Yeah. And I know that, like, from my perspective with the courses I teach with those inclusive access books, I like to take that universal design for learning approach and, okay, here's the text version. Now here's a video that also explains it.
Right.
Or here's an article that you might read that follows up on this. Yep. And so being able to share that with my students within the textbook.
Well, and that raises another real substantive question, and that is the idea of rights. Part of the reason that interactive textbooks are becoming such a thing in higher education is because they're licensed, they're not sold. So the user loses what's called first sale rights. You don't own the text, you don't own the book. You are merely paying for the privilege of using it.
Right.
Faculty need to understand that what they choose for their students has real-world consequences. We have students on this campus that go hungry rather than buy textbooks, so they can afford to go to school. And that's important because textbooks are marketed to faculty. They're not marketed to students. Faculty don't have to pay the cost of the textbook. Yep. And that's why, at least in my field, in history, I encourage people to use open stuff because there's no reason not to. The data is out there. What the package is, in fact, I've used articles and whatnot in place of textbooks in some areas so that students get content and something to talk about without having to pay through the years for something that they will not use beyond just the class that I'm teaching.
Yeah. Well, and it's amazing. I came across a textbook that I've used in my assessment for e-learning course. Mm-hmm. It was only, I think, $20 on Amazon, something like that. But then I found it was an OER.
Yeah. So why did you pay $20 for it?
Right. I'm like, so redid my entire course. I'm like, don't buy the textbook. Here's the OER of that textbook.
Yep.
And I think that's a valid thing. You know, the cost of books have gone up.
Let me tell you. Let me just give you some figures. Since I'm the collections librarian here on campus.
Please.
One of the things that drives me nuts, because I have been behind the curtain. I have driven this, to mix metaphors, I've driven this horse. Faculty often will see the cost of a book, and what they're seeing is only the cost to them if they choose to buy it. So it may be $45, okay? If you come to the library, you can get the same book, and we may be able to get a print copy for $45, but we'll get a digital copy for $132 for one user. And if we want unlimited users, which means anybody can use that book at the same time, it'll cost us 2 to 3 times as much for the same book that the professor will spend $45 for. So you can't assume that just because you can find a price, that's what your students can get it for. That's part of the game that publishers are making.
Yeah, it is crazy. But yeah, I know. I've a lot of my courses have moved more towards the OER or article-based or whatever the case is that can take that off of our students. Because it was interesting. I was talking to someone. They said that this past year here at SUU, they saw a significant increase of close to 60% of our students using the food pantry.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, that speaks a lot when our students are going to the food pantry to just have a meal.
Right. The choice of textbooks is only partly a faculty independence issue. Part of it is just pure marketing. The textbook reps will come into a place and they'll want you to choose theirs. And again, the faculty don't pay for it. It's the students who do. So if you've got a choice, choose an open text because if your students can get it free, they're much more likely to actually use it than going hungry to pay for the text that they have to do.
Do you think that some of this is also just tradition of we've always had textbooks in education?
Oh, absolutely.
And so therefore we're going to continue going out to and we view the textbooks from a publisher as being valid versus something that's
we like
OER.
to think that. We like to think that. And actually that's part of my interest as a scholar. Textbooks haven't always been part of higher education. They really have been part of higher education only after the Second World War. That's when commercial textbook publishing really took off. Prior to that, most textbooks, if faculty wrote books at all, they were written for general informed audiences and not as textbooks, just as books. And yes, there are exceptions. There's no question about that. Yeah. There are some that were written for texts. But most of them were produced locally in fairly small numbers and only for very specific courses. So people didn't care if they were making money off of books because they didn't have a lot of students. Well, after the Second World War, when we get the GI Bill, when we start pushing people into higher education, that's when publishers started thinking, well, wait a second. If there's 800 students using one copy of a book and everybody has to have a copy of this book, pretty quickly it becomes a scale game. And that was really the beginning of serious modern academic publishing. And it's only gone up from there. My career in publishing broke across the second consolidation. In the 90s, all of the companies that our firm worked for that produced Brooks Cole, Richard D. Irwin, Addison Wesley, all of these long-standing publishers, been publishing for 50 years, they had all got slurped up by Pearson, and within a fairly short time, Pearson had been bought by Bertelsmann, and there are no actual commercial United States-owned textbook publishers left in the country. They're all owned by foreign conglomerates. So if you're going to buy local, it ain't going to be from the United States.
So I have one last question. When a faculty member decides they want to write a book, there are lots of different routes. They could write the book from beginning to end.
Yep.
They could do more of the editor approach. Do you believe there's a better route to go for your first time? And I ask this because my wife, Jen McKenzie, and Dr. Bree Kramer both collaborated to edit a book on trauma-informed practices. And I know how frustrating that it was to be an editor and get all these chapters submitted.
Oh, yeah. Been there, done that.
Which approach would you recommend to someone who says, I'd like to have my name on a book?
There's good reasons to do it both ways, or to do it all any way that suits you. If someone is going to edit a book, and especially that usually means that they're going to get other people as contributors, then talk to a press early and let them know this is the outline, this is what I anticipate, this is what I think, this is who I think, this is what I think the schedule would be, and let them take a look at it at that point. Don't wait on an edited book. Go to the publisher first and let them weigh in on it. They may have suggestions, they may have input they want, they may want to turn you down and you go someplace else. That's something that needs to happen early. I mean, as a matter of fact, I got into exactly that this last year. I actually turned to a guy that I was sitting next to, one of my publishers, and I said, hey, we need a book on this. And he said, if you edit it, I'll publish it. And that was the beginning. That
Nice.
Simple, that informal. Now, we've got a working relationship, so that he understood that.
Right.
But if you're going to cold call a press, and there's no reason not to, you can do that, then make sure that you've got your ducks lined up and give them something that can be a decision point. Say, I want to do chapters on this. Here's who I think of writing these. You may or may not talk to them. The book that I'm working on, I just this last week finished filling out the last author for a chapter that really started 6 months ago. So we're going to move the due date a little bit because we didn't have everybody online. If it's my book and if it's in my field, there's also a good reason to approach a press and give them a look. It gives them an idea. It gets you on their radar. It gives you a contact. It builds your network. And then follow through. Don't drop the project and say, I just decided not to. Because they're going to invest time and attention in you and your project, okay? Yeah. However, almost all of the books in my field that I have completed and are currently on my list now are ones that I completely wrote beginning to end first and then went looking for a publisher. That's just the nature of my field. That doesn't work in other fields necessarily, but that's the way it works in my field. Partly because I wear two hats as an academic. Actually, I wear 4 hats as an academic, but so I have to kind of switch hats. I don't have a real tight schedule that I can say it'll be done with this chapter and then this one, and you can take a look at this one here. I just feel better making sure I can give them complete turnover so they can see the finished work. Now, they will probably insist on some editing, and a couple of things that I've done, I've had to go back and revise pretty heavily some chapters. But that's the nature of publishing. They're helping you put forward the best argument and the best face that you can put on. And they're not just, they're making a sellable product as well,
right.
but they're making something that you can be proud of. Sometimes a publishing relationship doesn't work out and either the publisher pulls out or the author pulls out. That's expected. That's okay. Just find another publisher if you're that committed to the subject. But for Pete's sake, listen to your editors because they usually have a much better feel for the field and for what else is going on than an individual author does. Take them very seriously.
Because they're going to know what the nationwide trends or feelings are. And,
well, discipline at least.
Discipline, yeah.
Yeah, discipline-wide.
Nation,
yeah. A lot of publishing in some fields happens outside the United States. And most American faculty don't really grasp what's going on beyond our borders. So if you're in a field where publishing happens in India or in Germany or in whatever, pay attention to that. A guy that I know in Tennessee, where we came from to here, he's never going to publish in the United States because his field is published abroad. That's just the way it works in his discipline.
Right.
So you have to be careful with that too. So you have to know, you have to pay attention, do your homework, and get help. There's no prize for doing a book by yourself. There isn't. So get people involved, ask for readers. My most recent book, I think I had 8 or 9 peers, people that I know that I trust, whose word I trust. They read the thing from beginning to end before an editor ever even looked at it, before I offered it to anybody. People have known I've been working on this particular book for a long time, and so I would get queries occasionally, and I would let people know. And I had some presses that I was really interested in, and others that I wasn't. I really, really, really wanted the University of California Press to do this, but I realized if I wanted to work the book that I wanted, UC Press wouldn't be interested. They were interested in a different kind of a product. So that's part of the decision as well. Yeah. Prestige is earned. It's not conferred necessarily.
I like that. Well, Dr. Saunders, let me retake that. Dr. Saunders, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about publishing, both in articles and books. I know that there's so much more we could talk about.
There is, and let me say 2 things. Number 1, talk to the Writing Center, talk to your colleagues. We have a scholarly communications librarian here on campus. Talk to him, and if you really get desperate, I am happy to talk with anybody about any kind of writing project in any field. I'm a historian, but I have helped people in sociology and in business and in, let me think, what was the other one? One in antiquities and a bunch of other fields, not because I'm the expert, but because I'm a fairly experienced sounding board for the process, and I'm happy to help anybody.
That's great. That's great. Thank you again for your time, and I'm probably going to be knocking on your door here shortly, because I do want to take that dissertation and put it into multiple articles and get information out there. So thank you again.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thank you to Dr. Richard Saunders for taking the time to talk to us about how publishing has changed over the years, how that might impact faculty at SUU, and the benefits it has for teaching and learning with our students. In our next episode, we're going to begin exploring the concept of open educational resources, or OERs. We'll be talking with OER specialist Chris Yonkin about ways faculty can begin implementing OERs in their courses. Join us next time on the Southern Utah University's Teaching and Learning Podcast.